I will lead by saying that this is not a practical guide to assessment is for learning. I think power comes from having the right questions rather than an answer. So this session is intended to leave you with more questions than it is answers. Assessment is for learning is written into policy. It is part of the curriculum's framework for assessment. It's an expected fundamental of your day-to-day practice. The development of assessment is for learning strategies was a government funded initiative that encompasses research and evidence which claim to show the recommended assessment strategies result in improved outcomes. The work of Black and William, which demonstrates that formative assessment is one of the most effective strategies for promoting student learning, can be identified as being highly influential to this. All this being said, assessment is for learning is not without its tensions. Education is saturated with government policies and local authority policies and political influence, and just a brief overview of how a few of these interact with one another can start to display complete contradictions or at least differing priorities. It's not the purpose of today to examine these in detail, but a key paradox of assessment is for learning and your role as an educator will be given some attention. Assessment is for learning proposes 3 main uses of assessment and 5 key strategies to achieve these. On the face of it, these appear to be relatively logical and able to be applied with minimal conflict. A more critical examination in context highlights a few potential problems. Autonomy in learning calls for learners to take increased ownership, be more reflective, engage in goal setting, and inform next steps in learning and future learning intentions. Pupils should be active participants in their individual learning journey in order to be a lifelong learner. They should be co-creators of success criteria. How is any of this possible when national curriculum, benchmarks, progression pathways, core standards predetermine the majority of the aspects of a young person's learning journey? The pressure is placed upon us as teachers to ensure learners will achieve an expected level at an appropriate time, or that learners will attain a Nat 5 or gain a certain number of hires, surely make it impossible to allow pupils to have authentic agency or autonomy over their learning. You know that everyone in Group A needs to get a grasp of subject-verb agreement pronto. They are more excited about further researching a report that was on Newsround during wet break. Timmy needs to get his head around linear equations, but he'd quite like to explore properties of 3D shapes because he watched a YouTube video about Rube Goldberg machines. This is learners showing agency. Would we just go with it? Our first thought is most often, probably not, I don't have time, and this isn't really what you need to be working on anyway. We usually say, maybe next lesson, and hope that they forget or the phase passes, or if we get really desperate, something like, that sounds like an interesting personal project for home. We will determine their next steps based on unit or termly planning or progression pathways, and at best, they will be coerced into thinking it was their idea. We will manipulate success criteria for tasks to suit our needs. That sounds interesting, but does anyone else have another idea? Great, let's go with that one. That sounds like what I want to hear. We might not even be as subtle as that. And this whole conundrum is why you were asked to consider your values before this session. Initially, I found it pretty hard to harmonise my values and beliefs with some of the expected practices. Firstly, I don't believe that learning is this perfectly linear experience that we can identify where a young person is at on their journey and predict what they need to know next. I don't even think that it's necessarily essential to start with basic concepts and build to more complex ones. Aspiring to complex concepts can help us to identify and motivate a desire to obtain the more basic skills. You can teach someone their music scales and get them to practice over and over and gradually move through simple pieces. Or you can say, "What would you love to play?" And then let's work out how we can get there. I know what sounds more inspiring. I think we need to stop thinking about learning as a manual that must be methodically worked through from start to finish and consider it as more of a website, a non-linear text with lots of jumping off points, driven and motivated through potential for self-determination and exploration. I believe learning intentions and success criteria often cause us to apply a deficit model to learning rather than an asset model. I believe we should be harnessing learners' talents and utilizing these to build towards improvement. Repeatedly identifying things lacking or not achieved is more likely to cause us to deter participation in a learning journey. Knowing your areas for development is undoubtedly important. However, blinkering the assessment of every task to a single learning intention and ignoring any incidental or alternative learning doesn't sit well with my personal views on education. As an adult in training sessions, we're regularly asked what we learned or what we'll take away. Inevitably, people have different answers, and that's okay. In fact, it's encouraged. But in a classroom, we often only give value to the learning intention that was written on the board at the start of the lesson. Currently, there is a big focus on closing the poverty related attainment gap. If we were to somehow achieve this, what difference would it really make? Would it bring equity to society? I have my doubts. Social capital and cultural capital have way too big an influence. Ultimately, who you know still matters. I recently read that social capital can be described as making the connections needed to get an invite to the Queen's garden party. Cultural capital is knowing how to act when you get there. Will raising the attainment of our most deprived young people in absolute isolation make them any more capable of getting an invite to a garden party? Despite all of the difficulties and associated logistical nightmares, I think the most effective way to achieve equity is by nurturing young people's ability to be empowered through agency and give them as many opportunities as possible to exercise this. More on this later. Most teachers went into the job because they were inspired or because they wanted to make a difference in lives. Not many people went into teaching with the ambition of being bang average, but it's easy to get beaten down, particularly when you stop believing in what you're doing. I've shared some of my values. You were asked to consider yours. Hold on to these. Finding a way to stay true to them is important. But don't hold on to your values too tight. You might be wrong. I might be wrong. But it is what I believe right now. And I encourage these to be challenged and examined regularly in the conversations that I have, in the books that I read, in the experiences that I have and I observe. Having said all this, it might be logical to deduce that I think assessment is for learning is structural nonsense that should be thrown out at the first opportunity. I don't. So, what is my point? I think that assessment is for learning is way more complicated and complex than we often choose to consider. Assessment is for learning is too often reduced to a set of tools that we can use in a classroom, often to tick a box on an observation form, or because we saw another teacher use them and the class looked like they had a lot of fun. These tools in themselves are not bad. They can be extremely powerful, but blindly applying them with no real conviction as to why will limit any impact. You are early career teachers. You are learning your trade. Assessment is for learning should be part of that. But as you apply it, you should be constantly considering why, to what end. Yes, you should be learning the rules and the processes, but as the Dreyfus model proposes, also aspiring to transcend these, to benefit the young people you work with. Which pretty much sounds like a fancy way of saying breaking the rules too, but from an informed position. The research says assessment is for learning works. The research says is probably my most hated phrase. You will find research to support anything. That is how we end up with flat earth societies and moon landing conspiracies. I think it's more accurate to say the research I choose to align with says. And I would encourage you to adopt this sense of criticality. Otherwise, when some guy doing a presentation uses quotes and stats to prove his point, you'll end up believing everything he says. Assessment is for learning is regularly shown to make an impact. Impact is subjective, and it is also dependent on how you choose to measure it. It is very easy to use learner attainment as the impact measurement of assessment is for learning, and it most regularly is. However, as previously discussed, attainment in our context is reliant on the compliance with predetermined standards. Attainment and learning are not the same thing. Impact measurement should also consider who it works for. Recent reports suggest that our most deprived young people continue to lag behind based on all measures of national attainment. In the last 9 years, why have assessment is for learning practices failed to make a notable impact on this? The research I choose to align with suggests that this shouldn't be at all surprising. Success of assessment is for learning, and therefore young people, is largely dependent on learners being able to reflect, self and peer assess, action feedback appropriately, form their own questions. Competencies of autonomy and agency. For a number of reasons, our most deprived young people have the most difficulty performing in such environments. The research I choose to align with also suggests that altering this is essential for long-term success. We need to really take the time and make a concerted effort to support all of our young people to acquire the capacity to meaningfully participate in purposeful direction and reflection of their learning, placing assessment is for learning as the priority rather than an afterthought. I align my values with assessment is for learning by focusing on the potential that lies within nurturing young people to have the capacity to be agentic learners. Measuring the impact of assessment is for learning through the enhanced abilities of young people to skillfully direct their learning, to overcome obstacles, to leverage the resources around them, and to create new opportunities. Unfortunately, sometimes this will involve modelling and scaffolding within the confines of our context, but the focus remains on developing the metacognitive skills alongside the predetermined objectives. Benchmarks, progression pathways, course guidelines can contribute to a false linearization of learning. But if made accessible to learners, these can also be a wonderful resource for them to explore and develop the vocabulary needed to articulate a journey or discover what is possible. Assessment is for learning can be criticised for being tied up in a false environment of autonomy. But we can also make sure that we are maximising the opportunities that present themselves or that we engineer, which allow learners to harness and test and reflect upon their skills of agency in scenarios of limitless possibilities. Schools around West Lothian are doing this. It is possible. My goal is to have young people leaving my class capable of learning anything, anywhere. Some will be high attainers in the traditional sense, some will not. But my hope is that the practices that I have used empowers them to be successful and that they are capable of defining that success themselves. Assessment is for Learning can support this. I mentioned that there are schools around West Lothian applying Assessment is for Learning practices in truly meaningful ways. I'd like to close by briefly sharing a few examples that I have encountered recently. There is a department within one of our secondary schools which has opted to entirely build the course curriculum around developing pupil metacognition skills. There is some content that acts as a vehicle to guide this and enable this, but the focus and the emphasis is always on developing learners' capacity to learn in general, not to memorise facts or processes to pass a test. This is a very bold move and places Assessment is for Learning practices at the very centre of what is happening. Despite some initial concern and pupils having to completely readapt to different sets of expectations than they were used to, that particular department's national assessment results have improved year on year. That course is now oversubscribed every year. In another setting, having become obsessed with creating domino runs, a group of learners set themselves the challenge of creating a domino run that would go from their classroom all the way to the front of the school. They quickly discovered that they didn't have enough dominoes. They decided that using cereal boxes would be a better idea, but they would have to be full cereal boxes to work best. They measured the distance to the door, they created a prototype, and they worked out that they would need 160 cereal boxes. They are currently in the process of working out the most effective ways to get the cereal boxes they need and spreading the word about their message and their goal that they have. They also decided that when they complete their task, that they want to donate all of the cereal boxes to a local food bank. They're 5 and 6 years old. And finally, during a recent period of remote learning, a couple of groups of pupils were asked to consider how they could use their skills and their talents to improve something, anything. After much consideration, they decided that they wanted to hold a festival of happiness to help cheer people up at such a hard time. The festival would showcase the talents of the people involved. They conducted surveys and research to see what was the most effective way of cheering people up. They advertised their festival, they created subgroups based on the different interests, they built a website to host the festival in an online space, created content, did live broadcasts, all self-motivated. These two groups were also from 2 different schools, and did all of this having never actually met in person. I'll let you try and identify all of the learning that is taking place in these experiences and opportunities, which throughout were guided by goal setting, establishing next steps, effective questioning, actioning feedback, and constant reflection with peers and the growing network of partners that they got. These are wonderful examples of teachers knowing the rules and transcending them for the benefit of the young people that they work with.